The crack of the auctioneer's gavel split the dry morning air of Caldwell, Kansas, on a bright Tuesday in September of 1882, and Julia Donnelly raised her hand one more time and outbid every single man in that dusty yard without so much as blinking. The crowd had gathered early that morning, drawn by the announcement posted in the window of the Caldwell Mercantile and tacked to the post outside the Silver Spur Saloon. Parcel 7 of the Hargrove estate was going up for auction, 40 acres of good grazing land, a well that never ran dry even in the hottest months of August, a small but solid timber-framed farmhouse, and a barn large enough to stable 12 horses comfortably. Old Elias Hargrove had passed away in late July with no living kin, and the county had taken possession of the land within weeks. The auction had drawn every man with ambition, and $1 to spare from 3 counties over. Julia Donnelly had arrived before anyone else. She had driven herself in from the edge of town in her late father's wagon, the one with the cracked left wheel that she had repaired herself with a length of iron she had traded 2 jars of her blackberry preserves for. She wore a deep brown dress of wool that had been let out at the waist twice already, practical boots that laced up to the ankle, and her dark hair pinned firmly beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had once been her father's. She was 26 years old, square-shouldered and serious-faced in the way that a woman who has been running her own affairs since the age of 20 becomes serious-faced. Her eyes were a pale, clear gray that caught the light like river water over flat stones. She stood at the edge of the crowd with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin level, and listened to the auctioneer, a wiry, fast-talking man named Porter Gibbs who wore a striped vest and carried a gavel like it was a weapon of war. The 12 men who had come to bid on Parcel 7 were a varied collection of ambition and self-importance. There was Gerald Fitch, who ran the feed store and had been trying to expand his land holdings since his wife had given him the look last spring that meant he had better do something impressive. There were the Dunnigan brothers, 2 red-faced men from over in Sumner County who bid together and finished each other's sentences. There was a banker named Holcomb who wore a coat that was too fine for an outdoor auction and kept mopping his forehead with a linen handkerchief. There were small ranchers, a cattle speculator from Wichita who had come specifically for this parcel, and several men whose faces Julia did not know but whose hungry expressions she recognized entirely. Not one of them expected her to bid. The auctioneer opened at $50. Fitch jumped in at $55. The Dunnigans went to $60. The banker from Wichita showed his hand early and pushed it to $80. Julia let them go. She stood quietly and watched the number climb. She counted her savings in her head the way she had been counting them for 3 months, $220 rolled tight in a cloth inside the lining of her coat. The land had been appraised at $110. She had planned for them to push the price, because she knew men and she knew auctions. At $125, the field had thinned to 5 bidders. At $150, only the Wichita speculator and Gerald Fitch remained. At $160, Fitch went red in the face and dropped out with a disgusted noise. At $175, the speculator hesitated for just long enough that Porter Gibbs began his countdown, and that was when Julia Donnelly raised her hand for the first time. $190, she said, clearly and without flinching. The yard went quiet in the specific way that yards go quiet when something unexpected has happened. Every head turned toward her. Porter Gibbs looked at her over the rims of his spectacles as if she had materialized out of thin air. "Ma'am," he said. $190, she repeated. "I believe I said it plainly enough." The speculator from Wichita blinked at her for a long moment, then looked around at the other men as if one of them might step in and fix this situation. None of them did, because none of them had the money left after being beaten down by the bidding war they had already waged. He looked back at Julia. He pushed his hat up on his forehead. He said, 200. 210, Julia said, before his number had even settled into the air. He stared at her. She met his gaze with absolute composure, her hands still clasped in front of her, her chin still level, her gray eyes steady and unhurried as a winter sky. He did not bid again. "Sold," said Porter Gibbs, who had recovered himself admirably, to the lady in the brown dress. "Ma'am, you'll need to come settle payment at the county office by end of business." "I am aware," Julia said. "Thank you." It was then that she became aware of being watched. Not the general watching of the crowd, which was already breaking apart into eddies of conversation and disbelief, and a few not very subtle comments about women and property and the natural order of things. This was a specific, particular watching, the kind that has a weight to it, like a hand resting on your shoulder without quite touching you. She turned her head slightly to the left, because that was where the feeling was coming from, and she found him. He was leaning against the fence post at the edge of the auction yard with his arms folded across his chest and his boots crossed at the ankle, watching her with an expression that was not surprise. It was something else entirely. He was a tall man with a lean build that spoke of long days in the saddle and few enough meals at a proper table, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work with their hands. His hat was dark, pulled low on his forehead, and beneath the brim his face was angular and sun-browned, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that the Kansas plains were built on. He had dark eyes, the kind of dark that catches light only at certain angles and keeps everything else close, and they were fixed entirely on her. He did not look away when she caught him looking. Most men looked away. It was the reflex of being caught in something, admiration, curiosity, assessment, and most men in Caldwell had learned by this point that Julia Donnelly's gray gaze was not a comfortable thing to be caught in unprepared. This man simply looked at her, level and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world and no reason whatsoever to be embarrassed about anything. Julia turned back to the matter at hand, which was making her way through the dispersing crowd to the county office to finalize her purchase. She had 40 acres and a timber frame house to take possession of, and she did not have time to catalog the expressions of strange men at auction yards, no matter how particular those expressions might be. She was nearly to the gate when his voice reached her. "Miss Donnelly." She stopped walking. She turned around. He had pushed off from the fence post and was walking toward her with an easy, unhurried stride that ate up the distance between them without appearing to hurry. She had not introduced herself to anyone this morning. She noted that with the clinical part of her mind that was always noting things. "You know my name," she said, when he had come close enough that she did not have to raise her voice. "Most folks in Caldwell know your name," he said. He had a low, even voice, the kind that did not waste any syllables. "You've been running your father's freight contracts since he passed. You've been doing it better than he did, from what I hear. And you just outbid 12 men for a piece of land that 3 of them were counting on walking away with today. 13, including yourself," she said. Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was the precursor to a smile the moment before it, like the sky a fraction of a second before the lightning actually appears. "I didn't bid," he said. "No," she agreed. "You watched." "I did." She studied him more openly now, because he was clearly not going anywhere, and because she had learned long ago that studying things directly was considerably more efficient than studying them sideways. He was perhaps 30 or 31 years old. There was a scar along the line of his jaw, old and faded. His hands, which were now hanging at his sides, were the hands of someone who worked stock. His coat was worn at the elbows, but the rest of him was clean and put together in the way of a man who has pride but not money to spare on appearances. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "You know my name." "Louis Rourke," he said. He did not offer his hand, which she noted because it was unusual. Then he said, "I have something better than Parcel 7. The words landed in the air between them, and Julia Donnelly looked at him for a long moment with those clear gray eyes and said nothing at all, which was sometimes the most effective response to an unexpected statement. "Better how?" she said finally. "The Hargrove estate backs up against my land on the north side," Louis Rourke said. "I've got 60 acres already. Good land, well watered. but there's a section about 20 acres that sits right between my north fence and the creek that runs through what you just bought. It's landlocked. I can't sell it, can't do much with it because there's no road access without cutting through one property or another." He paused. "I also have a house that's twice the size of the one on parcel 7, a barn that's already full of tools and equipment, and no interest in watching a woman who just demonstrated more backbone than every man in this yard try to make a 40-acre parcel work on its own when it doesn't have to." Julia kept her expression, even with the practice of long habit. "That is a considerable amount of information to offer a stranger," she said. "I'm not in the habit of being anything but direct," he said. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Rourke?" "A partnership," he said. "Strictly speaking, a business arrangement. You've got water rights I need. I've got land and resources that would make your 40 acres worth 3 times what you paid for it. We work the combined acreage together, split the profits according to what each party contributes." Julia looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "And if I say no, you'll watch me work 40 acres alone and say nothing about it." "It's your right to work them alone if that's what you choose," he said. "I'm not here to tell you what you need, Miss Donnelly. I'm telling you what I have." It was the right thing to say. She was aware enough of herself to know that it was the right thing to say and aware enough of the world to be suspicious of anything that was exactly right. She had been managing things alone for 6 years, since her father's health had first begun to fail, and she had quietly taken the reins of the freight business without making a production of it, and then for 2 years more since his death. She had learned to be suspicious of arrangements that sounded good, because the world had demonstrated a consistent interest in showing her that good arrangements had fine print. "I would need to see the land," she said. "Naturally. I would need to see any documents pertaining to your claim. Also natural. And I would need to understand the terms of this partnership in writing, with a lawyer present, before I agreed to anything." Louis Rourke looked at her with those dark eyes that did not give much away and said, "Miss Donnelly, those are exactly the conditions I would expect from a woman who just outbid 12 grown men for a piece of land she has clearly been planning to buy for some time." He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "The county office closes at 5. You go settle your purchase. I'll meet you outside in an hour and take you out to the property so you can see what I'm talking about with your own eyes." Then he turned and walked away, and Julia Donnelly stood in the autumn dust of the Caldwell auction yard and thought, for reasons she could not have articulated precisely at that moment, that she had not yet seen the last interesting thing that this Tuesday was going to produce. She went to the county office and paid her money, and signed her name in the ledger in her small, precise handwriting, and walked back out into the September afternoon with a deed in her hand, and her coat considerably lighter than it had been that morning. She stood outside the county building on the wooden sidewalk and looked out at Caldwell's Main Street, at the horses tied at the hitching posts, and the women moving between the dry goods store and the milliner's, and the men gathered outside the hardware shop in their particular way, and she felt the same thing she always felt when she had done something that needed doing. Not triumph, exactly. Satisfaction. The quiet, settled feeling of a plan that had worked. "You looked at the deed already," said Louis Rourke's voice, and she turned to find him standing a few feet away, leaning against the post of the county building's awning with his thumbs hooked in his belt, already there even though she had been at the counter for 40 minutes and had not seen him come in. "I can tell by the way you're holding it, like you need to make sure it says what you think it says." "It does say what I think it says," she said, folding it and putting it inside her coat. "Good." He straightened up and gestured down the street to where his horse was tied, a solid-looking gray quarter horse with a calm eye and well-kept tack. "I've got a spare horse at the livery if you'd rather ride than take the wagon." "I have my own wagon," Julia said, "the one with the repaired left wheel." She paused very briefly. "You noticed that?" "I notice things," he said simply. They went out to the land in the warm afternoon, Julia in her wagon and Louis on his gray horse, riding at an easy pace that matched the wagon without being obvious about it. The country outside Caldwell was wide and flat in the way that Kansas is wide and flat, which is to say, with a particular kind of grandeur that people from places with mountains tend to dismiss, until they have been under that sky long enough to understand what it is. The grass was going golden at the edges with the turn of the season, and the cottonwoods along the creek line were already showing yellow. The air smelled of dry grass and cooling soil, and somewhere far off, cattle. Louis Rourke's property declared itself before they reached the gate, because his fences were in better repair than anything surrounding them. The posts were straight and the wire was tight and the gate was hung level. Julia noticed this and filed it away. A man who kept his fences like that had particular qualities of mind that were worth knowing about. The farmhouse was stone on the lower half and timber on the upper half, with a good deep porch across the front and shutters that were painted the same dark green as the brush along the creek. It was not a fancy house, but it was a solid and cared-for house, and it was considerably larger than the timber frame on the Hargrove parcel. They stopped at the edge of the north pasture, and Louis showed her where his fence line ended and the unlocked 20 acres began. A long, flat stretch of grass that ran between his land and the creek that would now run through her property. She could see the logic of it immediately and clearly. The creek water that she now held the access rights to was the only viable water source for that section, and the only road access to it was through either her land or his. Without both parties working together, the 20 acres was useless to both of them. "You knew I was going to bid on parcel 7, Julia said. "I've been watching what you were watching for about 3 months, Louis said. He was standing beside her at the fence, looking out over the golden grass, not looking at her. Once the auction date was posted, it wasn't a difficult conclusion. "You could have approached me before today." "I could have," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark landed on the top wire of the fence not 5 feet from them and sang 3 notes and flew away. "I wanted to see what you did. You wanted to see if I could win it. I wanted to see how you handled 12 men trying to beat you to something you decided was yours," he said. He turned his head and looked at her then in that direct, even way he had. "Now I know." Julia held his gaze for a moment. She had been looked at many ways in her life, with pity after her father's death, with calculation when men realized she was managing the freight business, with open dismissal when they realized she intended to keep managing it, with occasional respect when she did something they had not expected. This look from Louis Rourke was none of those things. It was, as far as she could determine, simply honest, as if he were looking at something and seeing it clearly, and that was the whole of it. "I'll want my lawyer to draft the terms," she said. "His name is Carter Webb on Kisham Street," Louis said. "He's who I was going to suggest." She blinked just slightly. "He's your lawyer." "He's the only decent lawyer in Caldwell. He's honest. He'll write it fair." Julia Donnelly looked at Louis Rourke for a long moment in the afternoon sun and said, "All right, Mr. Rourke. I will read the draft before I sign anything." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. 3 days later, Julia signed the partnership agreement in Carter Webb's office. The terms were clear. Louis Rourke would contribute 60 acres, all existing livestock and equipment and labor. Julia Donnelly would contribute 40 acres, including water rights to the creek, a cash reserve of $30 toward operating costs for the first season, and equal labor. Profits from cattle sales and any crop production would be split 60-40 in favor of Louis's larger land contribution, with the provision that the split would shift to 50-50 at the end of 2 productive seasons. The 20 landlocked acres would be worked jointly, with any eventual proceeds from its sale split equally. Either party could dissolve the arrangement with 90 days written notice. Carter Webb read it twice, asked both parties several pointed questions, and then signed his name as witness. He was a small man with careful eyes who had clearly seen bad arrangements come through his office before, and was visibly relieved that this one was not one of them. Julia rode home to the boarding house on Maple Street, where she had been living since selling her father's house to pay off his debts, and sat on the edge of her bed in the small room with the green curtains, and held the copy of the agreement in both hands and thought about what she had just done. She had tied herself to a stranger, a man she had known for 3 days and spoken to, in total, for perhaps 4 hours. A man who was pleasant to look at, which she was old enough to know was irrelevant, and who said what he meant, which she was old enough to know was rare, and who had stood at the back of an auction yard and not bid on a thing but simply watched her, which was, she was honest with herself about this, the part that had stayed with her most. She folded the agreement and put it in the box under the bed where she kept the important things, and changed out of her good dress, and told herself that she had made a sound business decision, and that was all it was. She believed that for approximately 2 weeks. The first 2 weeks of the partnership were entirely businesslike. Julia moved out of the boarding house and into the Hargrove farmhouse, which she cleaned thoroughly and which turned out to be better constructed than it appeared, with good square walls and a sound roof and a kitchen large enough for real cooking. She brought her wagon, her father's tools, what furniture she owned, and her 3 dozen jars of preserves, which she lined up on the kitchen shelf with the precision of a general disposing troops. Louis came over every morning around 7, and they went over the work for the day and divided it and went and did it. They were building a new fence along the north line of the 20-acre section, which required hauling posts and cutting wire and working in tandem because fence building alone is a particular kind of misery. Louis set posts and Julia ran wire, and they developed a rhythm for it that required no discussion after the first day because they were both the kind of people who could read a task and understand what the other person needed without having to narrate it. On the 5th day of fencing, Louis cut his hand on the wire, and Julia went and got the clean cloth she kept in the wagon and wrapped it without being asked. He watched her do it with the same even expression he watched most things with. She tied the knot efficiently and handed it back to him. "You've done that before," he said. "My father had large hands and very little patience with wire," she said. He looked at the wrapped hand. "Thank you," he said. "It was practical," she said, but she was thinking about the warmth of his hand in hers, which she told herself was also practical. At the end of the 2nd week, a man named Cleet Pryor rode in from the south with 2 hired hands, and a look on his face that Julia did not like at all. Pryor was a substantial landowner from the southern edge of Sumner County, the kind of man who had done his accumulating in the years right after the war when land was confused and prices were depressed and certain types of men moved fast. He was heavy through the chest and had a red face and small eyes, and he dismounted at Louis's gate and looked at the improvements to the fence line with an expression of dissatisfaction that he did not bother to conceal. "Rourke," he said. He looked at Julia and his expression shifted into something that was not quite courtesy. "Ma'am." "Pryor," Louis said. He had come out of the barn and was wiping his hands on a cloth, and he stood at an easy distance from his fence gate with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and his posture the posture of a man who is entirely unthreatened. "Something I can do for you. I had an offer in on the Hargrove parcel," Pryor said. He did not look at Julia when he said it, which told her he knew perfectly well that she was the one who had bought it. Through an agent. The auction should have been run differently. "The auction was run by the county," Louis said. "Any complaints about the process, you take those to the county assessor's office." "I'm not here to complain about the process," Pryor said. He put his big hands on the top rail of the gate and looked out at the land with an acquisitive expression that Julia had seen before on men who were deciding how something might be taken from its rightful owner. "I'm here to make a straight offer. I'll pay $240 for the Hargrove parcel. That's $50 above what was paid for it." He was looking at Julia now. He had the manner of a man who expected to be dealt with, which was different from expecting to be answered. "The land is not for sale," Julia said. "Everything's for sale at the right number," Pryor said. "Mr. Pryor," Julia said, with a pleasantness in her voice that had nothing soft in it at all, "I paid $190 for that land, which was exactly what I intended to pay for it, and it is mine by legal deed. I am not interested in your offer at any number. I hope the ride from Sumner County was not too hard on your horses. Good afternoon." Pryor looked at her for a moment longer, and then he looked at Louis, and there was something passing between those two looks that Julia noted but did not yet have enough context to fully understand. Then Pryor said, in a quieter voice that was actually more unpleasant than his louder one, "You think hard about this, Rourke. The both of you." "We've thought about it," Louis said. "Good afternoon." Pryor and his men rode out. Louis watched them go until the dust settled, and his expression had not changed, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that had. "He made an offer on this land before I did," Julia said. "Through an agent 6 weeks ago," Louis said. "The county turned it down because the offer was below appraisal and he was trying to skip the public auction process. He didn't take it well. You knew about this and didn't mention it. I didn't want it to affect your decision about the partnership." Julia considered that. "What else does he want with this land?" Louis leaned on the fence rail and looked out at the southern horizon where Pryor's dust was still settling. "He's been trying to consolidate the land along this creek for 3 years. If he gets the water rights, he controls how much flows down to 3 other properties south of here. It's not legal exactly, but it's the kind of thing that's hard to fight once someone has the land in hand. He wants to control the water. He wants to control everything he can put a fence around," Louis said. "The creek rights that come with your parcel are the main obstacle." Julia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So this partnership is also protection against Pryor?" Louis looked at her steadily. "That is part of it," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise. 40 acres alone is a harder thing to hold than 80 acres together. I told you I would be direct." "You did," she said. "Thank you for confirming it." She walked back to the farmhouse and finished preparing supper and sat at her kitchen table in the early evening light and felt the complicated weight of knowing that she had been right to be suspicious of good arrangements and also right to make this one. Both things were true at the same time, which was not comfortable but was honest. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, which is to say they had the rhythm of hard work in the fall on the Kansas plains, which is considerable. There were cattle to move and pastures to manage, and the last of the cutting and storing to do before the cold came. Julia turned out to have a gift with horses that Louis remarked on the second time. She brought a nervous yearling to hand without any fuss, and he began naturally leaving the horse work to her, while he handled the heavy timber work and the repair of the equipment in the barn. They ate supper together 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes at her kitchen table and sometimes at his, and they talked about the land and the cattle prices and what the weather was going to do and what Carter Webb had said about a boundary survey and 100 practical things. And somewhere in the middle of all those practical things, they began to talk about other things as well. Julia learned that Louis Rourke had come to Kansas from Missouri 6 years ago, which was a fact she could have guessed from certain inflections in his speech. She learned that he had a brother in St. Louis who was a printer, and that they corresponded irregularly. She learned that he had learned cattle work from a man in Texas who had pushed him as hard as any man could be pushed, and that he had been grateful for it afterward, even though he had not been grateful at the time. She learned that he read when he had the chance, which was not often enough, and that he kept 2 shelves of books in the sitting room of his house that she had not noticed the one time she had been inside. Louis learned that Julia had grown up in Caldwell, born there when it was barely more than a collection of ambitions and rough timber, and that her father had been a freight hauler of middling success, who was better with people than with money, and had loved his daughter with a single-mindedness that made up for most of his other deficiencies. He learned that she had taught herself to read contracts at the age of 16, when she realized her father was signing things he did not understand, and that she had been quietly renegotiating his freight contracts on his behalf since she was 18. He learned that she had been engaged once briefly to a man named Samuel Evers, who had turned out to be the kind of man who saw a competent woman and wanted to keep all that competence in a box where he could take it out when he needed it, and put it away when he did not. What happened to him? Louis asked, on a November evening when the wind was beginning to carry cold in it, and they were sitting on his porch after supper with coffee cups in their hands. He married a woman from Wichita who was considerably more decorative and considerably less interested in the freight business, Julia said. I heard they are moderately content. Louis looked at her in that direct way. His loss, he said. Yes, Julia agreed. She looked out at the dark pasture and the stars that were beginning to appear in the enormous Kansas sky. It was. There was a silence between them that was the particular kind of comfortable silence that does not require filling, and Julia was aware, sitting there with the cooling coffee in her hands and the wind in the grass and the stars coming out one by one, that she had not been this comfortable in the company of another person in a very long time. The awareness of it was both pleasant and slightly alarming, which she supposed was the nature of these things. November brought the kind of cold that settles into Kansas like it intends to stay, and with it came complications. The second week of November, one of Louis's 3 working hands, a young man named Abe Garrity, who was pleasant and hardworking, and had been with Louis for 2 seasons, came to tell him that he had been approached by a man working for Cleet Pryor, who had offered him double his current wage to go work at Pryor's operation, and also to report anything he observed on this property. Abe told Louis about it directly, the same morning it happened, which said something good about his character. Louis thanked him, gave him a small raise out of his own pocket, and said nothing more about it. But that evening he told Julia, and she sat at his kitchen table and turned her coffee cup in her hands and thought it through. He's going to keep pressuring, she said. Yes. And if he can't buy the land or undermine the operation, he might try to find some legal claim. He hasn't got one, Louis said. The deed is clean. The water rights are clearly documented. Men like Pryor don't need a real claim, Julia said. They need a plausible one. They file something, they make it expensive to defend, and they wait for the other party to run out of money or patience. Louis looked at her with the expression that she had come to recognize as the one that meant he was revising his understanding of something. You've seen this before, he said. I've read about it, she said. And I watched it happen to a man named Eckhart who had a freight yard in Abilene when I was about 20. Prior types are not new. Louis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been thinking about going to speak with Sheriff Holt. Tell him what Pryor said when he came to the fence, Julia said. The comment about thinking hard. Get it on record while it's recent. It may not help now, but it establishes a pattern. Louis looked at her steadily. You are a considerable person, Julia Donnelly, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formality attached to it, and she was aware of it in the specific way she had been trained by experience to be aware of things she should not read too much into. She kept her expression even. I am a practical person, she said, which is different. Not always, he said. And he looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing more. And Julia looked back at him and said nothing more either. And the lamp burned quietly between them, and outside, the November wind pushed the grass in long, running waves across the moonlit pasture. The visit to Sheriff Holt took place the following week, and went about as well as such visits ever went. Which is to say, Holt wrote things in his ledger and made noises about keeping the peace and keeping a watch on things, and everyone parted ways, understanding that the law in Caldwell in 1882 was a good deal more useful after a crime had occurred than before one. Louis came back from town in a tight-shouldered mood, and Julia made coffee and put a plate of cornbread on the table and said nothing pointed until he had eaten some of it. He's not wrong that there's nothing to act on yet, she said. I know that, Louis said. He put both hands flat on the table. They were large, capable hands, roughened by years of fence work and horse work and the general labor of trying to make something good out of a piece of ground. She looked at them for a moment. I don't like waiting for a man like Pryor to decide when things happen. So we make things happen first, Julia said. He looked up at her. We file the boundary survey, she said, this week. We get the water rights registered with the county properly, every document in order, and we do it before the end of the month. If Pryor is going to invent a claim, we want our claim so clean and so thoroughly on record that there is no angle from which to approach it." Louis looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Carter Webb can start on it tomorrow." "Good," she said. "Now eat the rest of that cornbread. You look thin." He looked at her with something that was not quite the smile and was everything just before the smile, and he said, "Yes, ma'am," in a tone that was entirely not the tone of a man talking to his business partner, and Julia refilled his coffee cup with great composure and told herself she had not noticed the tone at all. She had noticed it entirely. December came in with its short days and long silences, and the work of the land shifted to the indoor work of winter mending equipment, bookkeeping, planning for spring. Louis had a habit of reading aloud in the evenings when Julia stayed late helping with the accounts, which she had not expected. He had a good reading voice, low and unhurried, and he read from whatever he had on the shelf, a history of the Louisiana Purchase, a collection of essays, a novel by Dickens that Julia had not read and found, to her mild surprise, that she could not stop listening to. One evening in mid-December, they were sitting in the sitting room with the books on the shelf visible behind Louis's head and the fire built up well against the cold outside, and he was 3 chapters into the Dickens when he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," Julia said. "Why didn't you try to buy land sooner? You've had the freight income for 2 years. You've been managing it well. You could have had enough saved 18 months ago." She considered the question. It was a fair one. "I needed to know what I was buying," she said. "I watched 4 or 5 parcels come through auction before the Hargrove land. I was learning what they were worth and what the men bidding on them were willing to pay and how those 2 numbers related to each other." "You were calibrating," he said. "I was being careful," she said. "There is a version of this story where I buy the wrong land at the wrong price and am ruined inside of a season. I did not want to be that version." Louis was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the firelight. She was aware of how she must look to him in this room, her practical dress, her hair which she had taken down earlier in the evening because it gave her a headache when it was pinned too tightly, which she had not been thinking about relative to the presence of company, her hands in her lap with the calluses from the fence wire and the reins. "You think about risk very carefully," he said. "I always have," she said. "Does it get lonely?" he asked. And the question was so quiet and so direct and so entirely unexpected that she did not have an answer ready, which was a rare thing for her. She looked at the fire for a moment. "Yes," she said, "sometimes." He said nothing for a moment. Then he closed the book with one finger keeping the page and leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, and said, "Julia." "Louis," she said, with the exact same quiet inflection, "I am going to say something and I want you to know that it does not change anything about the partnership if you want it not to," he said. "The arrangement stands regardless. Carter Webb has that in writing and it will remain so." "All right," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I have been finding reasons for the past 2 months to be at the fence line that is closest to your farmhouse," he said. "And I have been reading aloud in the evenings because you stay later when I am reading, and I prefer it when you stay later. And I sat at the back of that auction yard in September and watched you outbid 12 men for something you had clearly been planning for a long time, and I felt something that I have not felt before. And I have been trying to be patient about it because you are the most careful person I have ever met, and I did not want to be a thing you had to be careful around." Julia Donnelly sat in the firelight of his sitting room and heard every word of what Louis Rourke had said, and felt the truth of it land in her chest like the first warmth of spring after a very hard winter. She kept her hands in her lap and her expression composed for about 5 more seconds, and then she said, "I have been finding reasons to stay later." He looked at her. "For about 6 weeks," she said. Something in his face opened up then, something that had been held carefully in check, and it made him look different, not younger exactly, but less guarded, the way a landscape looks different when the clouds move and the full sun comes through. He said, Then I'm glad I said something. I am also glad, she said. They sat for a moment with this between them, new and somewhat enormous, and then Louis said, "Can I read the rest of the chapter?" And Julia said, "Yes, please." And he opened the book again and read, and outside the December wind pressed against the windows and the fire burned low and warm. And something had changed so thoroughly and so quietly in the way that real things change that Julia thought she could have marked the exact moment of it, the exact word on the page where it happened, the way you can sometimes mark the exact moment the season turns. He did not kiss her that night. He walked her to the door when she left and said good night, and she drove back to the farmhouse in the cold and the dark and looked at the stars for a long time before she went inside. He kissed her 3 days later in the barn, in the middle of a sentence about whether the gray horse needed new shoes before winter set in firmly. It was not planned. She had turned to look at the gray horse's left forefoot, and when she looked back up, he was closer than she had expected, and the question that had been building between them for 3 days answered itself in the most practical way possible, which was simply to resolve. It was a brief kiss, careful and entirely serious, the way Louis Rourke did everything. Then he stepped back and looked at her and said, "The horse needs new shoes." "I know," Julia said. Her heart was conducting itself in a thoroughly undignified manner. "I'll ride him into the smithy tomorrow." "Good," Louis said. "Good." And they went back to work because that was who they both were, and the work was real and it was there. And underneath it now was something else entirely that was also real and was learning how to be there too. January was hard, as January on the Kansas plains generally is, and the partnership and the courtship alike were conducted in short, cold daylight hours and long evenings of fire and lamplight, and the gradual, careful accumulation of knowing another person. Julia learned that Louis had a habit of waking before first light and going to stand on his porch in the dark and simply looking at the sky, which she had not known before but which she recognized as a version of something she did herself. He learned that she kept a small journal, not a diary of feelings but a practical record, lists and notes and calculations, that she had kept since she was 17, and that she had filled 8 such books. He learned that she was a better cook than she let on. She learned that he was a better dancer than he let on, which she discovered at the Christmas dance held in the Caldwell town hall, where she had gone with the firm intention of dancing with no one, and had danced with Louis Rourke 3 times, which in the social mathematics of Caldwell in 1882 was approximately 2.5 times more than friendship, and precisely 1 dance short of an announcement. The talk of the town, which had been buzzing since the auction, found a new and more comfortable groove with this to settle into. Most people were satisfied with it. Julia's friend Martha Hennessy, who ran the milliner's shop and was one of the sharper observers in Caldwell, put her hands on her counter and said, "Well, that's the most sense either of them has shown all year," and went back to her ribbon display. Gerald Fitch, who had still not recovered from being beaten at the auction, made a comment at the hardware store that was not repeated to Julia directly, but that reached her through the well-established channel of small-town information, and she considered it, filed it under irrelevant, and went on with her life. February brought Clete Pryor again, not in person this time but through Carter Webb's office, in the form of a letter contesting the boundary survey on the grounds of an alleged earlier claim that had been improperly lapsed by the previous county assessor. Carter Webb read it twice and called it what it was, which was exactly what Julia had predicted: a manufactured claim designed to be expensive and slow to resolve. Julia sat in Carter Webb's office with Louis beside her and listened to the lawyer explain the situation and then said, "What does it cost to fight it properly?" "At least $60, Carter Webb said. "Possibly more if he takes it further." "We have the reserve," Louis said. He was looking at Julia. "We use it," she said. "We filed the counter documentation this week. Everything clean and complete, nothing left out, nothing he can point at as a gap." Carter Webb pushed his spectacles up his nose. Miss Donnelly, I have to say, your documentation already is quite remarkably thorough. The original deed, the water rights registration, the survey results, the boundary markers, it is all in order. Then the counterfiling will be straightforward, Julia said. For a reasonable judge, yes, Carter Webb said carefully. Julia absorbed that. Which judge will it go to? Likely Judge Callahan if it goes to formal hearing. Louis said Callahan is fair. He is, Carter Webb confirmed. He is also slow. This could take until spring. Julia looked at Louis. He looked at her. There was an entire conversation in that look, the weight of the $60, the weight of the time, the weight of having to spend the winter under the shadow of a manufactured claim, and underneath all of that, the steady shared understanding that this was what they had both known was coming and they had prepared for it, and they would go through it together. File it, Julia said. The counterfiling went in the following week. Pryor's lawyers made noise, and Carter Webb responded to the noise with documentation. And the whole thing settled into the slow machinery of territorial law and ground forward at its own pace, while Julia and Louis went about the business of keeping the operation alive through the worst of the winter. It was in the middle of all of this, on a cold Wednesday in late February when the wind was coming from the north, and the sky was the white-gray of packed snow cloud, that Louis Rourke came to the farmhouse on the Hargrove parcel for supper and stayed afterward by the fire. And in the quiet of that evening, after the dishes were cleared and the lamp turned low, he took something from his coat pocket and set it on the table between them. It was a ring. Small and plain, gold, with a single small stone that Julia could not identify precisely in the lamplight except that it caught the fire in an interesting way. She looked at it. She looked at him. "It was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me when I left Missouri. She said to give it to a woman who was worth giving it to." "Louis," Julia said, "I know the timing is not ideal," he said. "The thing with Pryor is unsettled. The spring work will start before we've had a chance to breathe. I know that." "Yes," she said. "But I also know that I have been looking for reasons since September to spend every hour I can in your company, and that when I am not with you I am thinking about what you would say about whatever I am looking at, and that the operation makes more sense, and the days make more sense, and everything makes more sense when you are part of it." He paused. He was looking at her with those dark eyes that she had learned over 5 months gave everything away once you knew how to read them. "I am not asking you to need me," he said. "You don't. You never will. I am asking you to choose this. To choose me." Julia Donnelly sat in her own kitchen in the firelight and looked at Louis Rourke and felt the full weight of the choice he was offering her, which was not the weight of dependency or compromise, but the weight of something she had not let herself name clearly until this moment, which was simply that she loved him. It had arrived in the way the best things arrive, gradually and then all at once, the way morning comes or the way water seeps into stone, so slow you don't see it happening until the stone is changed. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you." He reached across the table and took her hand, both hands, actually both of her capable, calloused, capable hands in his, and held them and smiled. Not the precursor to a smile, not the moment before. The real thing. It was, she thought, possibly the best thing she had seen in a very long time. They were married in April, on a day when the Kansas sky was that particular impossible blue of early spring, and the grass was coming green along the creek, and the cottonwoods were putting out their first leaves. Carter Webb was there, and Martha Hennessy, and Abe Garrity and the other hands, and a small collection of people from town who had been watching this unfold since September with varying degrees of invested interest. The ceremony was held outdoors on the land, at the boundary between the two properties, which Julia had chosen deliberately, and which Louis had agreed to without asking why, because he knew why. Reverend Douglas from the Methodist Church performed the service. Julia wore her best dress, which was the same brown wool from the auction day, because she was the kind of woman who did not have a particular white dress, and Louis had presented her the morning of their wedding with a small bunch of early wildflowers that he had ridden out at dawn to find along the creek bank, and she had put them in a jar of water on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time before she pinned a single one to her dress. They exchanged vows in the prairie wind, with the long grass running gold and green around them and the sky enormous above them. And when Reverend Douglas said the words that meant it was done, Louis put the ring on her finger and looked at her with that complete, open look, and she looked back at him with her own, and that was all that needed to happen. The wedding supper was at Louis's house. Their house now, Julia's things being moved in the following week, and Martha Hennessy had brought more food than 12 people could eat, and Abe Garrity played a fiddle badly but enthusiastically. And at some point in the evening, Louis and Julia were standing at the edge of the porch in the cool April dark while the sounds of celebration came through the open door behind them, and Louis said, quietly, "How does it feel?" Julia considered the question with her characteristic honesty. "Like something I thought I did not want," she said, "and like something I cannot imagine not having, both at the same time." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, which was a thing she had been practicing in small ways since December and had still not entirely become accustomed to allowing herself, and said, "I know the feeling exactly." Judge Callahan ruled on the prior matter in early May, which was longer than hoped and shorter than feared. His ruling was clear and unsentimental. The alleged earlier claim was insufficiently documented and bore the marks of retroactive construction. The existing deed and water rights were legitimate and properly registered, and the contest was without merit. Pryor was ordered to pay a portion of the filing costs. Carter Webb read the ruling aloud in his office, and then took off his spectacles and cleaned them with the deliberate care of a man who has just done something he is quietly pleased about. Pryor did not come back to the fence line after that. He retreated to his operation in Sumner County, and his name came up occasionally in the way that defeated ambitions come up in passing, diminished, a reminder of a thing that had been attempted and failed. What he had wanted was to control the water. What he had was his existing land, no more than that, and the particular kind of satisfaction of knowing that the thing he had reached for had not been available to him. The spring was a good one. The grass came in thick, and the cattle put on weight, and the creek ran high with snowmelt from the north. Julia and Louis worked the combined acreage with the two hands they kept on, Abe Garrity, and a man named Dell who had been with Louis for 3 seasons, and was as steady and uncomplicated as the land itself. And the first season of genuine joint production went better than the most optimistic projection in their partnership agreement. In June, Julia dug a kitchen garden behind the farmhouse and planted it with the deliberate pleasure of someone who has been waiting for the right permanent ground to plant things in. She grew tomatoes and squash and green beans and the particular variety of pepper that her father had always favored, and she made enough preserves to last 2 winters and sent a dozen jars to Martha Hennessy and brought 3 jars to Carter Webb's wife, who received them with the slightly overwhelmed warmth of a woman who did not get many unexpected kindnesses. The summer evenings became their favorite time, the long, slow light of Kansas summer evenings that seemed to last forever, the land going gold and the air cooling from the heat of the day, the two of them sitting on the porch of Louis's house together with the sounds of the operation settling around them. Louis kept reading aloud. They finished the Dickens and started a history of the cattle trails that Louis found useful and Julia found interesting, and then they found a novel that belonged to neither of them, that Martha Hennessy had pressed on Julia at some point, and that turned out to be absorbing beyond expectation. They disagreed about things, which was inevitable and, Julia thought, necessary. They disagreed about the best way to rotate the south pasture. They disagreed about the price at which to sell the fall cattle, and Julia turned out to be right about this, in a way that Louis acknowledged directly and without drama, which she appreciated enormously. They disagreed about whether to take on a 3rd hired hand for the harvest season, and Louis turned out to be right about this. because the third hand made the difference between a brutal 2 weeks and a merely hard 2 weeks, and Julia told him so in the same direct way he had told her about the cattle prices. They discovered that disagreeing and being right in alternation was actually one of the more enjoyable aspects of being married to a person who was worth disagreeing with. In August, on a morning when the heat sat on the plains like a hand pressing down, and the sky was the white of overexposure rather than the blue of spring, Julia sat at the kitchen table before Louis was awake and looked at the jar of wildflowers she had started keeping on the table because she had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she liked having them there, and she thought about the particular feeling she had been having for about 2 weeks, which was a feeling she recognized from what her friend Margaret Parsons had described once in careful clinical terms. She told Louis that evening after supper. She told him the way she told him everything, directly and without preamble, sitting across the kitchen table from him in the last of the day's light, and watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, which was to lose all its characteristic composure in a single moment, like a stone skipped across water, the way it goes from solid to sliding to sinking in just a few seconds. "Julia," he said. "Spring," she said. "March or April, I think." He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment in the way he had looked at her that first day at the auction yard, with that complete, unhurried attention. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also going to need someone else to handle the fence wire for the next few months, which I hope you appreciate means I am serious about it." He laughed then, which was the thing she had been waiting for, the laugh that she had learned was rare and real and meant something when it came. And then he kissed her forehead and stayed crouched beside her for a long moment with his hand wrapped around hers. And outside, the August sun went down in a long blaze of orange and red over the Kansas plains. The fall of 1882 tipped into winter with the operation in good shape. The cattle sale at the Caldwell stockyard in October came in above what they had projected, which meant they cleared the first season with a healthy reserve and the beginning of a real working fund. Louis deposited the earnings at the Caldwell bank and came home and put the deposit slip on the kitchen table and looked at Julia with a quiet satisfaction that she knew was not just about the money, was never just about the money, but was about the steady accumulation of proof that the thing they were building together was real and sound and worth the building. Carter Webb revised the partnership terms in November, as the original agreement had provided for at the end of a productive first season. The split moved to 50-50. Julia signed her copy of the revision and put it in the box under their bed now, their house, hers and Louis's, and sat for a moment with the box open, and looked at the original auction deed still folded in there, the deed to the 40 acres she had bought in September with $220 and her own nerve, and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing where one thing had led. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold but not brutal, which is the best one can hope for on the Kansas plains, and Julia managed the bookkeeping and the planning for spring from the kitchen table, while the wind pressed at the windows, and Louis repaired equipment in the barn, and came in the evening smelling of cold air and oil and horses, and they ate supper together every night and sat by the fire afterward and read and talked and were quietly, entirely at home with each other. January brought a letter from Louis's brother Incent. Louis, who had heard by this point about the marriage and the operation, and wrote to say that he intended to visit in the spring and that he expected to find his brother looking considerably more prosperous and considerably less solitary than when he had last seen him, both of which, the letter strongly implied, he approved of. Louis read the letter aloud at the breakfast table and Julia listened and said, "Your brother sounds like someone worth knowing." "He is," Louis said. "He will like you." "How do you know?" "Because he is very direct," Louis said, "and he respects people who are also direct, and you are the most direct person I have ever met." Julia considered this. "I will take that as a compliment." "It is the highest compliment I know how to give," Louis said. February was when the snow came in earnest, 2 weeks of it in a row with days of wind between, and they lost one calf to the cold despite everything they did to prevent it, which was a loss and was grieved as losses are grieved in the practical way of people who work with animals, and no loss is part of it. Louis came in from the barn after the calf and stood in the kitchen doorway with cold in his face and said nothing, and Julia put coffee in his hands and said nothing, and they stood together in the warm kitchen and let the cold thing be a cold thing without having to fix it or explain it. March came, and with it the first green at the tips of the grass, and the sound of the creek running higher, and the long gradual easing of winter back into something warmer. Julia was large and slow-moving and thoroughly tired of being large and slow-moving, and Louis had taken over the morning horse chores with a quiet thoroughness that she found both practical and touching, and he had also, she noticed, started bringing the flowers to her inside the house rather than leaving them for her to find, which was the kind of small shift in attention that was more telling than a speech. The child came on a Tuesday morning in early April, as the same impossible blue sky of the previous April's wedding watched over the plains, and the cottonwoods put out their first new leaves exactly as they had a year ago. The midwife from town, Mrs. Hartley, a capable and no-nonsense woman of 60, who had delivered a considerable portion of the population of Caldwell over the past 20 years, arrived in time and managed everything with the efficiency of long experience. Louis waited in the kitchen in the manner of men who are instructed to wait in the kitchen, which is to say with imperfect patience and a great deal of coffee, and when Mrs. Hartley came out and told him he had a son, he sat down in the kitchen chair with a rather sudden quality, as if his legs had made a decision about what his feelings required. The boy was named Patrick after Julia's father, which had been decided in December without much ceremony, because Julia had said one evening that if the child was a boy, she would like to name him Patrick, and Louis had said yes without hesitation, and that was the end of that particular conversation. Patrick Thomas Rourke arrived in the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's firm, assessing expression, and made his opinions about the situation known immediately, and Julia looked at him in the early morning light of their bedroom and felt something so vast and so immediate that she did not try to put words to it. Louis came in when Mrs. Hartley led him and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and looked at Julia and said, "Patrick Thomas Rourke," very quietly, as if he were trying the name out in this new version of the world, and Julia said, "He looks like you," and Louis said, "He looks like you," and both of these things were partially true in the way that new people are partially all the people who came before them. Spring turned to summer and summer to fall, and the second year of the operation brought its own developments. Louis's brother, whose name was James, and who was indeed direct and warm and exactly as interesting to know as his letter had suggested, visited in May for 2 weeks and spent half of that time following Louis around the operation asking questions about cattle and the other half sitting on the porch with Julia while Patrick slept in her arms, talking about books and the state of the world with a lively intelligence that Julia thoroughly enjoyed. He went back to St. Louis and wrote a letter the following month that said, among other things, that his brother had done considerably better than expected in every respect, which Julia read aloud to Louis, who said, "That is the most James thing he has ever written," and looked entirely pleased. The operation grew. They added 10 head of cattle in the fall sale and reinvested the profit in better equipment and the repair of the Hargrove farmhouse, which Julia had decided to use for the hired hands since the main house, Louis's original house, had the extra room now with Patrick needing his own space. The farmhouse cleaned up well and Abe Garrity and Dell moved into it with visible satisfaction, and the whole arrangement settled into itself with the efficiency of a thing that is well designed. Julia went back to the freight contracts in the winter, not out of financial necessity, but because she had found she did not want to let the business lapse entirely, and because the additional income was useful, and because she had spent 6 years building those relationships and she saw no reason to abandon them. She managed the contracts from the kitchen table on winter mornings, the same way she had always managed them, with Patrick in a basket beside her, progressing from sleeping to batting at things to pulling himself upright against the table leg. And Louis brought her coffee without being asked, and did not comment on the freight contracts because he understood, as he understood most things about her, that it was hers, and it was real, and it did not need his opinion. The second winter was quieter than the first. Pryor's name came up once, in a conversation at the Caldwell feed store, where Gerald Fitch mentioned that there were rumors Pryor had overextended and was having difficulty with one of his note payments. Julia heard this from Martha Hennessy on a Thursday afternoon and felt no particular satisfaction about it beyond the abstract satisfaction of a system working correctly. What had been attempted had not succeeded. What was real and rightful had held. That was enough. Patrick Rourke learned to walk in the spring of his second year, on the porch of the main house on a morning when the April sun was slant and warm across the boards, and Julia was sitting in the porch chair watching him, and Louis was standing at the porch rail also watching. And the boy let go of the rail with both hands and stood for a moment in the absolute concentration of a small person discovering something enormous, and then took 3 steps toward his mother and sat down abruptly and looked at his own feet in apparent astonishment. Julia picked him up and said, "Very good, Patrick Thomas." In the serious way she said most things, and Patrick looked at her face and grabbed her nose with one hand, which was his standard response to being addressed directly. Louis was smiling. The real smile, the one that transformed his angular face into something that Julia still thought was worth looking at every single time, and he said, "He walked," and she said, "He walked." And they were both ridiculous about it in the way that parents are ridiculous about these things, which is entirely appropriate and necessary. 3 years from the auction, the operation was producing well enough that they had cleared the debt entirely and had begun to build a genuine reserve. Carter Webb, reviewing the books in November, made several careful statements about the soundness of the position and the advisability of further land investment if an appropriate parcel came available, and Julia and Louis looked at each other across the lawyer's desk with the shared look of 2 people who had been thinking the same thing for some time. The parcel in question was 20 acres on the east side of their existing land, belonging to a widow named Mrs. Caldwell, who had been managing it alone since her husband's death 2 years prior, and who had come to the conclusion that she was ready to move to Wichita to live with her daughter. The land was good and the price was fair, and the purchase went through without drama, which was, Julia reflected, both entirely satisfying and slightly anticlimactic after the theater of the Hargrove auction. Louis, reading her expression when she signed the deed for the Caldwell land, said, "Not quite the same as the first time." "No," she agreed. "The first one had 12 men and Porter Gibbs and a man from Wichita who had not expected to lose. And me at the fence post," he said. "And you at the fence post," she said. He was looking at her in that way, the unhurried, direct way that she had once found alarming in its honesty and now found, she could say this clearly to herself and to him, the most comfortable thing in the world. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Which part?" "Any of it," he said. "All of it." Julia looked at him across Carter Webb's desk, in this small law office in Caldwell, Kansas, in the fall of 1885, with Patrick on her lap chewing thoughtfully on the end of her glove and the deed to 120 combined acres in her hand, and thought about the question with the thoroughness she brought to all questions. "I regret nothing," she said. "And I would do it all in exactly the same order." Louis held her gaze for a moment longer, and the smile was there, the real one, complete and unguarded, and he said, "So would I." And Carter Webb signed his name to the Caldwell deed with the air of a man who was witnessing something larger than a land transfer and was quietly glad to be part of it. The years found their shape, as years do when the people living them have built something worth inhabiting. Caldwell grew and changed around them. The cattle trail traffic was shifting. the railroad bringing new things and new people, the town's edges pushing outward and its character shifting from the rough energy of the early cattle drive years to something more settled and complex. Julia watched it happen with the same clear-eyed attention she brought to everything, and she and Louis talked about it on the porch evenings that remained the fixed point of their days, the place where everything got said that needed saying, and a great deal was communicated without being said at all. Patrick grew into a serious, brown-eyed boy who had his mother's particular quality of stillness and his father's directness, and a love of horses that appeared to be entirely his own, unlearned and innate. He could manage a horse with confidence by the age of 5, and rode out with Louis on the property by the age of 6, with a small hat pulled low on his forehead, in a way that made Julia set down whatever she was doing, and watch them go from the porch with a feeling she had stopped trying to name precisely, because it was too large and too multifaceted for a single word. He had a sister by the time he was 4. She was named Clara, for Louis's mother, which was Louis's suggestion and Julia's immediate agreement, and she arrived in the world with the same dark eyes as her brother and a vocal quality that Mrs. Hartley described as robust, which was the most diplomatic way to characterize a child who clearly had opinions and no difficulty expressing them. Clara Rourke grew into the kind of child who ran rather than walked and asked rather than waited and loved fiercely and loudly and completely, which was so different from both her parents' characteristic restraint that Julia sometimes looked at her daughter and thought that all the feeling that both she and Louis had spent years keeping carefully managed had found an outlet, and its name was Clara. The family the Rourkes became was a real family in all the ways that word means, not the easy or the decorative version of it, but the lived version. With its friction and its tenderness and its daily negotiation and its particular language of glances and habits, and the specific way that Louis always refilled Julia's coffee cup before his own, and the specific way that Julia always had the account books open on the kitchen table when he came in from the morning work so they could go over them together while the day was still fresh, and the specific sound of the house in the evening with the children settled, and the fire built low and the two of them on the porch or in the sitting room end. The quiet between them that was not absence but presence, the most comfortable kind of silence there is. There was a night in the summer of 1887, the 5th year of their marriage, when they were sitting on the porch after a long hot day, and the sky was doing what the Kansas sky did in summer evenings, turning colors that seemed improbable until you had lived under them long enough to expect them, and Julia was looking at the creek line where the cottonwoods caught the last light, and she was thinking about the auction yard in September of 1882. She thought about it sometimes, not with nostalgia exactly, but with the interest of someone examining a pivotal point in a road, the specific junction where one direction and not another was taken. "What would you have done," she said, "if I had said no?" Louis, who had been looking at the same sky, looked at her. He did not have to ask what she meant. "Gone back to working the land alone," he said. "It's what I had before. You would have been fine." "Yes," he said, "but fine is not this." She looked at him, he looked at her. The evening light moved over his face in the way it did at this hour, at this angle, catching his eyes in that particular way that showed what was in them, which was everything. "No," she agreed, "it is not." They had the 60 acres, the 40 acres, the 20 landlocked acres now fully productive since they had put in the access road, the Caldwell 20, the Hargrove farmhouse where Abe Garrity had been living for 4 years, and had recently mentioned, with considerable embarrassment, that he was considering proposing to a woman from town, which Julia had received with great composure and immediately begun planning for, because Abe Garrity was worth keeping. They had the 140 combined acres of it, the well that never ran dry, the creek with the water rights that Pryor had wanted and had not gotten, the barn with the 12 horses, the kitchen garden, the 32 varieties of preserve, the 2 children, the accounts that balanced and the days that meant something and the evenings on the porch, and the fire in the sitting room in winter, and the reading aloud and the coffee in the mornings, and the fence lines in good repair. They had, in the specific accounting of Julia Donnelly, who had become Julia Rourke on an April day 5 years ago, and who still kept the deed to the 40 acres in a box under the bed, everything that mattered. Louis reached across the space between their porch chairs and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and held his. And they sat like that in the last of the summer evening light, while the sky went from orange to rose to the deep blue-purple of the coming dark, and the cottonwoods went still with the dropping of the wind. And from inside the house, they could hear Clara saying something emphatic in her carrying voice to Patrick, who responded in his measured one. And somewhere in the barn Dell was doing the last check of the evening, and the creek ran in the dark beyond the fence line. "Louis," Julia said. "Julia," he said in the same quiet tone. "I am glad you had something better," she said. He squeezed her hand once the way he did and said, "So am I every single day." And in the dark that came down soft over the Kansas plains, over their fence lines and their creek and their 140 acres, and their house with the lights in the windows and their children and their horses and their life that they had built with their own hands out of a September auction, and a fence post, and an honest man who had watched a woman outbid 12 men, and walked over and told her the truth. Julia Rourke leaned her head back and looked at the stars coming out one by one in the enormous sky, and felt the full, settled weight of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was not a small feeling. It was not a simple feeling. It was the kind of feeling that takes years to build and takes the right person to build it with, and she had both the years and the person, and the plains stretched out dark and wide and endlessly patient around them, and the stars came out, and the night was warm, and everything was as it should be. Everything was entirely, completely, and at last as it should be.